The cabin door was seconds from sealing shut when Marcus Whitfield's phone buzzed with the message that would end his career. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Don't bother coming to the gate." He stood frozen on the jet bridge, 1 foot in the aircraft, 1 foot in the life he was about to lose, while behind him, 30,000 feet of sky waited for a flight that no longer needed him. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that the universe has a way of balancing the scales, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House so you never miss a story that reminds you why we keep believing in good things. Marcus had worked as a flight dispatcher for Halcyon Aviation for 6 years, ever since his wife Renata passed away and left him alone to raise their daughter, Josephine, who was only 2 years old at the time. He wasn't a pilot, he wasn't a flight attendant. He was the quiet man behind the scenes who calculated fuel loads, checked weather patterns, and made sure every aircraft that left the ground did so safely and legally. It was steady work, and steady was what Marcus needed, because steady meant he could pick Josephine up from daycare, steady meant he could be home for dinner most nights, and steady meant he could keep the promise he'd made at Renata's grave that he would never let their daughter feel like she'd lost both parents. But steady had never mattered to Vanessa Kirkland. Vanessa was the newly appointed CEO of Halcyon Aviation, a woman who had climbed the corporate ladder with a reputation for ruthlessness that preceded her into every boardroom. She had taken over the company 8 months earlier after a hostile buyout, and since then, she had trimmed the workforce with the cold efficiency of someone balancing a spreadsheet rather than someone deciding the fates of families. That morning, she was scheduled to fly out on the company's private jet to close a merger deal in Geneva, and she wanted the manifest clean, the staff minimal, and the flight dispatched by someone new, someone she'd handpicked, someone who hadn't questioned her fuel calculations the week before in front of the board. Because that was Marcus's real crime. Not incompetence, not negligence. He had, in a private meeting, respectfully pointed out that Vanessa's directive to shave reserve fuel margins on international flights in order to cut costs violated FAA safety regulations. He'd said it calmly, professionally, the way he said everything, but Vanessa did not tolerate being corrected, especially not by a man she considered replaceable. She smiled at him in that meeting, thanked him for his input, and 3 days later, sent the termination text minutes before her own flight was set to depart. Marcus stood on the jet bridge holding his phone, feeling the floor tilt beneath him even though the aircraft hadn't moved. 6 years of loyalty erased in one sentence. He thought of Josephine, 7 years old now, who had a dance recital that Friday and needed new shoes for it, who had a lunch account at school that needed refilling, who had no idea that her father's entire world had just cracked open on a jet bridge in front of strangers. He thought about the mortgage, the daycare bills that had become after-school program bills, the quiet arithmetic of raising a child alone on one income. And he thought, with a bitterness he rarely allowed himself, that he had done nothing wrong except tell the truth. The gate agent, a kind older woman named Bettina Cho, touched his arm gently and asked if he was all right. Marcus shook his head, not trusting his voice, and turned to walk away from the gate, from the aircraft, from the only stability he'd built since Renata died. But something in him, some small, stubborn ember of dignity, made him stop. Before he left, he pulled out his personal notebook, the one where he kept handwritten backups of every flight calculation he'd made that week, a habit from years of being cautious in an industry where a decimal point could mean the difference between life and death. He photographed the pages showing the original fuel calculations for Vanessa's flight, the ones that met FAA minimums, and the amended calculations that had been forced through by his replacement, a young dispatcher named Colton Reyes who was eager to please and unfamiliar with international reserve requirements. Marcus didn't send them anywhere yet. He simply saved them, the way a man saves evidence not out of vengeance, but out of a lifetime of believing that the truth should exist somewhere, even if no one asked for it. He drove home that afternoon under a sky so blue and ordinary it felt like an insult, picked up Josephine from her after-school program, and told her, with a smile he had to manufacture from nothing, that Daddy was going to have a little more time to spend with her for a while. She hugged him around the waist and said that sounded nice, and Marcus had to turn away so she wouldn't see his eyes fill with tears he couldn't afford to let fall in front of her. Meanwhile, 31,000 feet above the Atlantic, Vanessa Kirkland's jet was climbing toward cruising altitude when the first warning light appeared on the flight deck. The aircraft's fuel monitoring system flagged a discrepancy between the flight plan filed with air traffic control and the actual reserve fuel loaded onto the aircraft. Colton Reyes, back at dispatch operations, had rushed the recalculation Vanessa demanded, cutting the reserve margin closer than regulations allowed in order to save weight and, by extension, fuel costs on paper. It was a small number, a seemingly insignificant percentage, the kind of shortcut that looks harmless until the sky turns uncooperative. And that afternoon, the sky did exactly that, as unexpected headwinds over the ocean began eating into the flight's fuel reserves faster than anticipated. The captain, a seasoned pilot named Desmond Achebe who had flown for Halcyon for over a decade, noticed the numbers didn't sit right. He radioed dispatch and got vague reassurances from Colton, who didn't yet understand the gravity of what he'd approved. Desmond, trusting his instincts over inexperienced paperwork, contacted air traffic control directly, and within minutes, the discrepancy was flagged by the FAA's monitoring systems, which had been alerted through a routine audit trail cross-check. The very kind of audit trail that existed because dispatchers like Marcus had spent years building rigorous documentation practices into Halcyon's systems. The FAA's regional office, reviewing the flight's filed numbers against the aircraft's actual telemetry, determined that the jet had departed without meeting minimum legal fuel reserves for the route, a violation serious enough to trigger an immediate directive. The aircraft was ordered to divert and return to its departure airport for inspection and correction before continuing. Vanessa, sitting in her private cabin with a glass of champagne already poured in anticipation of her Geneva triumph, was informed that her multi-million-dollar merger flight was turning around because of a fuel violation. Fury didn't begin to describe what she felt. She demanded answers, and the answers led, inevitably, back to the changes made in the 24 hours since Marcus Whitfield had been removed from the flight's dispatch chain. By the time the jet touched back down at the departure airport, FAA investigators were already waiting, and so was a very nervous Colton Reyes, who, when questioned, admitted under pressure that the fuel margins had been altered at the CEO's direct instruction, against the original calculations filed by the previous dispatcher. Vanessa tried to deflect, tried to claim ignorance of technical specifics, but aviation regulations don't bend for corporate titles, and the investigators began pulling records that eventually led them to request the original documentation from Marcus Whitfield himself. When the FAA investigator called Marcus that evening, he almost didn't answer, assuming it was a scam call given the day he'd had. But something told him to pick up. He listened as the investigator explained the situation and asked if he had any documentation of his original calculations before his termination. Marcus, sitting at his kitchen table while Josephine colored quietly beside him, opened his notebook and, with a steady voice that surprised even himself, began reading off the numbers he had photographed just hours before losing his job. The investigation moved quickly after that. Marcus's meticulous records, combined with Captain Achebe's testimony and Colton's admission, painted an undeniable picture. A CEO who had knowingly pressured her staff to violate federal aviation safety standards to save costs, and had fired the one employee who tried to stop her. Within the week, Halcyon Aviation's board, facing potential FAA sanctions and a public relations catastrophe, placed Vanessa Kirkland on administrative leave pending a full review, and Marcus received a call from the interim operations director, a soft-spoken man named Grigor Petrescu, offering him not just his old job back, but a promotion to Chief Dispatch Safety Officer, a newly created role built specifically around the diligence Marcus had shown. Marcus sat in his kitchen holding the phone, looking at Josephine, who was drawing a picture of an airplane, unaware that her father's integrity had just rewritten both their futures. He thought of Renata, of the promise he'd made her, of every quiet, unglamorous choice he'd made to keep his daughter safe and their life steady. He hadn't fought for recognition. He hadn't fought for revenge. He had simply refused to let a life lie, even when it cost him everything, and in the end, the truth had found its way back to him the way truth so often does, quietly, patiently, and right on time. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that honesty and quiet courage still matter in this world, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with someone who might need this story today. Your support means more than you know, and it helps us keep telling stories like Marcus's. And before we close this chapter, here's a special request. If you've ever stood at your own crossroads, choosing integrity over convenience even when no one was watching, type, "I chose the truth," in the comments below, so we can see just how many hearts in this community beat the same way Marcus's did. Marcus Whitfield went back to work 3 weeks later, not as the man who got fired, but as the man whose honesty had grounded a CEO's private jet and, in doing so, had lifted his own life higher than he ever imagined it could go. Josephine got her new dance shoes that Friday, and her father was there in the front row, clapping the loudest, finally steady in a way that no longer felt fragile, but earned.